Republican instead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
I am delighted to welcome to the Enemies List today two authors and thinkers about American democracy who I think you're going to find very valuable. Stephen Livitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, authors of Tyranny of the Minority, have been ringing the bell loudest among many folks who warned about the fragility and the dangers American democracy faces today. I'm absolutely thrilled to have them on the program. We're going to get into the discussion right now. Stephen, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today on the Enemies List.
Thanks for having us, Rich.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Great. So let's start out with the, with the recognition that I think a lot of Americans, since the Trump era and since January 6th in particular, have suddenly become aware that our democracy may not be as robust and resilient and impervious to the sort of cracks in it that are showing than they were before. Talk to me about where you both see the state of American democracy, the state of our republic in this moment, because I think we're about to go through a big stress test in 2024 that will make 2020 and 2021 look like a warm-up exercise.
It may. I mean, I think it's obviously very important that Donald Trump was defeated and eventually removed from power in 2020. I don't want to understate the importance of that. We would be in much worse shape had he managed either legally or illegally to hang on to power. Mm-hmm. So the 2020 election and the turnover of power was extremely important. That said, I think a lot of us, a lot of Americans kind of breathed a sigh of relief after 2020, 2021 and kind of wanted to turn the page. And the fundamental problems that gave rise to Trump, that gave rise to 2020 and 2021 are still there. Mm-hmm. A radicalized Republican Party that continues, that no longer fully embraces the rules, democratic rules of the game, and a set of institutions that are protecting and encouraging that radicalization. And so until we get to the underlying problems of a radicalized Republican Party and institutions that empower it, we're going to continue to face crises, as you said, Rick.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think folks underestimate there was a part of the Republican Party in 2015, 16, and maybe 17. And I used to talk to these people a lot. A lot of them were my former clients and friends. And it was this belief that somehow there would be some normative forces in the Republican world that would constrain Trump's behavior, that would dial him back, that would pull him back from the brink. And those were all complete delusions. That was magical thinking. Talk to us a little bit about how all the sort of guardrails have disappeared from what was a party that once was dedicated to limited government and individual responsibility, and has transformed itself into sort of the cheering section for a wannabe authoritarian.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, there's a couple of things going on here. I mean, one, with all political parties, there's multiple strands within it. I mean, within the Republican Party, there has always been, and especially before 2016, and if you think of the presidential primary process and Republican presidential primary process, there was always a kind of extremist fringe. But, when it came time, to choose the candidate for office, these forces were generally sidelined. I mean, what happened in 2016 was that seemed to no longer be possible. In our previous book, How Democracies Die, we described this process of kind of failed gatekeeping, where political leaders thought that they could kind of ride the tiger and stay in charge of it, but very quickly lost control of it. So that was a critical kind of feature of trying to understand what happened in 2016. And so just as there are extremist forces in every democracy around the world, there have always been, and and even in the Democratic Party, if you think back to the kind of Jim Crow era as well. But in the Republican Party before 2016, these forces were there, but the party leaders lost control, and that's what makes the U.S. different from a lot of other democracies. Is that these fringe elements are in charge of one of our major parties, and it's hard, as Steve was saying, to maintain a democracy when you have one political party, only one political party committed to the rules of the game. So increasingly, we see that the party leadership has as such as it exists, has lost control. It doesn't really exist anymore.
Right.
And so one of the questions I guess we puzzle through a lot is, why isn't politicians want to win re-election? They lost the popular vote in 2016. They lost the popular vote and the presidency in 2020. And normally there's a kind of self-correcting logic to electoral competition. And that's the genius of democracy. That's the supposed genius of the American political system, is that you lose, you regroup, you put up a new front, you come up with a new set of ideas. And what we're puzzling through is, why isn't that happening? Why isn't that happening to the Republican Party when, increasingly it's clear the Republican Party, lost this whole series of elections during the Trump era, regained the House in 2022, but, in a sort of disappointing fashion. And so what we are trying to is puzzle that through. And we think part of the explanation is that our institutions are set up in such a way that it's possible to win power without winning majorities. And when that's the case,
clearly,
when that's the case, you then you don't try to win majorities, and so you don't moderate to the same degree. So this is in some sense the kind of one of the central theses of our book that we can elaborate.
I do want to talk about that, because we in about 30 states in the country were Republican, and there are some Republican states that are just Republican states. They are the demographics, the population, the culture, they're just hard red states. But there are about 27 to 30 of these states where they should be a lot more balanced than they are electorally. So talk to us a little bit about why the incentives of Republican control of these states, including redistricting, judicial selections, use of executive power, etc. I'm right in thinking that those states have this sort of negative incentive structure to open up and be more small d democratic, because they are holding on to power structurally, not electorally, if that makes any sense.
Right. As long as I think there are more than one thing going on. The activism, the sort of beating heart of the Republican Party, certainly the activist base, is quite Trumpist. Certainly ever since the rise of the Tea Party, the people who fill the meetings, the people who pressure our local and state politicians tend to be pretty Trumpist. So that pull exists as well from below. But it's a lot easier to hang on to power through what you call sort of structural mechanisms, rather than building broad coalitions. As Daniel said, if you don't have to go out and win popular majorities, and there's a shortcut, or there's an easier route, you're going to do it. And for now, this may be very destructive in the longer term, but for now, Republican leaders, whether it's in Wisconsin or in the U.S. Senate or at the national level, are kind of taking the easier route.
Yeah, I can say this from some experience on my part, particularly in the state of Florida, where I've done politics my whole adult life. The plan to take over what was a blue state, became a purple state, and transform it into a red state has never depended on getting a majority of the voters to follow along. It has been dependent on building the structures of money, political capacity, and operational political capacity, at redistricting, which has been one of the greatest success stories of the Republican Party nationally, in terms of corroding fair elections. And it's rarely been about persuasion. It's rarely been about drawing people into a set of ideas or ideals. Is one of the big incentive structures here? Look, the Republican Party used to be comprised of the traditional three legs of the stool: individual liberty, free market conservatives, social conservatives, and foreign policy conservatives. And now it seems to be comprised of a sort of nihilist caucus of people who want to burn down systems, norms, institutions, money people who basically only are there for the tax cuts, and social conservatives are still sort of playing a key role there. How does a movement like that sustain itself over time without going down this path of sort of authoritarian abuses?
Yeah, well, I think you just answered the question. I mean, that is the only way to go if you are going to have this agenda, this three-legged stool that can't win majorities. I mean, the only way to win power is to either construct or leverage existing institutions that can propel yourself into power. I mean, we come to this partly. Both Steve and I, we spent our career studying other democracies in other parts of the world. I spent a lot of time studying German conservatives in the 19th century.
Sure.
Who are these, aristocrats, the East Prussian Junkers, who were, really opposed to democracy. But there was a kind of famous slogan, actually, that the German Conservative Party used at the time, because these aristocratic party can never win majorities, but they controlled the political system. And so at one point they had this slogan: we don't want to be we want to be a small but powerful party. We want to be a small but powerful party. The only way you can be a small but powerful party is if you are working in an authoritarian system, right? So so I think what so this is something that has happened before in history. That political parties, again, they're interested. People want to gain power, and so you use the institutions that are around you. And at the national level, at least, it's very easy to win win the presidency without winning popular majorities. You can control the Senate without winning popular majorities. And then also, I mean, as you're describing at the state level, this may be a little more difficult, but it's I think that this is also happening at the state level through, gerrymandering and, take Wisconsin, where the Republican Party is able to have supermajorities of the seats in the state legislature without winning supermajorities in the public. In any statewide office, they really have struggled to win majorities. And so these institutions are the crutches upon which they rely. And then this kind of has this feedback effect where this reinforces the most extremist forces in the party. So that's again why we come back to the kind of institutional diagnosis of what's gone wrong. And until we address that, we're going to be facing this kind of this unholy amalgam that you just described.
I'm a registered Democrat, which will probably not shock you, but I will sleep better at night and will feel more secure about the health of our democracy when we get to a place where the Republican Party can beat the crap out of the Democrats at the national level, where the Republicans can win way over 50% and get back to a place where they were winning national majorities. At that point, I think the party will become much more moderate and much more willing to play by democratic rules.
It would have to be. It would have to be. And I will say there was a vision of the Republican Party, whether you agree or disagree with that. There was a period of time after 2008 and after 2012 where a lot of Republicans, I was one of them, was like, okay, guys, we can't keep doing this. The number of white voters is going to keep declining. The number of non-high school graduates or non-college graduates is going to keep declining. The demographics are going to catch up and kill this party. We've got to reform and change and operate differently. And of course, we were on the wrong side of political history by thinking that. My friend Sally Bradshaw helped run the famous autopsy. My friend Tim Miller was part of that. I mean, all of us were contributing to this set of ideas that the party, and look, before 9/11, George Bush wanted to do education reform and encourage home ownership across the country. That was not where the GOP ended up. And the collapse of faith in institutions has been both organic and engineered. And that's where that party is now, because they don't want to reform. They don't want to broaden. They believe in this almost like blood and soil white America that is a powerful cultural hook. It really is. I'm not going to deny its power among a lot of Americans, but it's not just working class Americans. It's a lot of white guys who've been told by Fox News every day, you're the oppressed one. You're the one who's really got it hard in this country. You're the one who's behind the eight ball because of the elites. when you look at, and how democracies, I mean, when you look at collapses of democracies, where would you say we are on that spectrum right now?
I think we are. I mean, we're a strange case in that U.S. has a lot of things going for it in terms of democratic, in terms of remaining robust democracy. U.S. democracy is not easy to kill, and so I think it's still very unlikely that we consolidate an autocracy of the kind that we see, say, in Russia or even in Hungary, because the opposition forces, the small d democratic forces, led by but not limited to the Democratic Party, are quite strong. They're well financed, they're well organized, they have a lot of strength in the media, and we also continue to have some very strong institutions: a still independent judiciary, federalism, a strong legal system. So what I think we are headed into, and we've already headed into, and you hinted at this as well, Rick, is a period of very rough waters, of instability, of sliding in and out of crisis. There may be short periods of authoritarian rule. There may be some violence. So this could be a very ugly period, but I think it's unlikely that we would consolidate into an autocracy, and that's where the United States is a little bit different from, say, Spain or Chile and or Germany and Italy, other regimes that we talked about that really collapsed into full-scale authoritarian rule. That's my view. Danny may have a different view.
Yeah, so I mean, and sometimes people misunderstand Steve's diagnosis as like optimistic or good news. We're not going to look like Russia. We're not going to look like Hungary. But this is a disaster. I mean, let's be really clear about what this means. I mean, first of all, the massive social instability, violence that we're, I think, already seeing. I mean, there's sort of no reason to think it's going to end anytime soon. What this means for our politics and our ability to address public policy problems. I mean, let's imagine, trying to deal with gun control or deal with, climate change or deal with, any of the major pressing issues. You pick your issue. If you look at the House of Representatives today, this is it. I mean, we're in it. I mean, we have complete inability to function. And, there'll be moments, like I think President Biden came in and was able to get some stuff done. And so there'll be moments of kind of success, but there'll be moments of crisis. In the next Supreme Court nomination process is going to be a disaster. And so this kind of instability and sort of sense that we're always right on the verge of crisis. I mean, that feeling that we all have of looking forward to the 2024 election and thinking, my God, what can go wrong? That takes a toll on a democracy, and that takes a toll on a society. And it's not the kind of society that I think any of us want to live in. It's not the kind of democracy that we imagine that we all deserve. And so that's, we need to really take that seriously. It's not a rosy picture at all.
I think William Gibson once said the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. I think sort of the collapse of democracy is not just evenly distributed yet. There are places where it's much more imperiled than others. And the place I think it's going to be the most imperiled if you do have Trump in office again is they will dismantle, because Steve Bannon says he's a Leninist, and they've got a game plan to dismantle every institution of government that they possibly can. They want to break it as thoroughly as they can, eliminate any kind of civil service, eliminate any kind of independence from the central authority, which is one of those hallmarks of authoritarianism, is that the dear leader runs everything. I won't go so far as to say it's the sort of a North Korean model, but it is a very centralized Soviet style model almost, where you would have a concentration of power among a very limited number of individuals. So not to put the world in too dark of a light, where do you think America needs to, how do you think America can strengthen its democracy? How do you think we can sort of rebuild some of our resilience and refocus on preserving some of the things that make us one of the oldest and best functioning democracies in the world, although it may not always feel that way?
Well, we lay out 15 proposals in the final chapter of our book that are aimed at effectively democratizing our democracy. And before jumping in, let me just make a broader point, which is that the era that we've all grown up in, the last 50 years, has been an era of almost total non-reform, where even the idea of constitutional change, constitutional amendment, has kind of been considered ridiculous. It's been off the table. But that's actually not true for most of U.S. history.
Right.
From the very beginning, from the time our Constitution was written, American leaders and activists have been discussing, debating, proposing, pushing, finding ways to make our political system more democratic, make it better. It began with the Bill of Rights, continued with the Reconstruction reforms, with the expansion of suffrage, with the progressive era reforms, the reform where we began to, the amendment that allowed us to directly elect our senators rather than have them indirectly elected. For most of our history, we have been gradually pushing to make our system more democratic. And we've stopped doing that. We've stopped doing that work in the last half century. And so what we are calling for, and democracies need to do that. They need to update. Sometimes they learn from other democracies. Sometimes they change it to adapt to changes in society, changes in the world. So we've got a very good constitution, a constitution that has served us well, a constitution that should obviously remain in place, but that could be amended to make our system more democratic. And so, for example, we call for elimination of the Electoral College. We are the only presidential democracy on earth where the loser of a presidential election can become president. That's a real problem. We also call for a set of reforms that are not constitutional, but that involve some important changes in our political system. The elimination of the filibuster. For no other established democracy has a super majority rule for passing regular legislation, right? A majority in the legislature should pass regular legislation. And we also call for a set of reforms making it easier to vote. Most democracies, voting is a core part of modern democracy. In most democracies, the government thinks it's a good idea that people vote and takes a number of steps to facilitate voting. So people automatically become registered where they're 18.
Right.
Some countries make it mandatory to vote. It's seen as a civic obligation. But elsewhere, it's
Australia.
People are registered when they turn 18. People vote on a Sunday or a national holiday. It's made easy to vote. And so the idea that it's actually that there are obstacles to voting, that it's hard to vote, is it's just antithetical to democracy in our view. So we call for a set of reforms to make it easier to vote. That's a few. There are more.
Okay. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, a couple of things about this. One, like, your listeners might be listening, this sounds really radical. This is impossible. Isn't this scary to dismantle these institutions we've come to rely on? And one of the points, when we look at other countries around the world, that, often there's great fear of institutional reform. But, when countries got rid of the Electoral College in other places, or let's say eliminated upper chambers, I mean, that's not something we're at all calling for. People, sort of thought, well, this is going to bring our system to an end. And often, it was sort of a big nothing happened afterwards. I mean, the democracies only became stronger. I mean, so some of these things that we've grown accustomed to, obviously a lot of our institutions are worth preserving and defending, but there's some things that can be changed, and and the world may continue to go on and actually work better. And so, I mean, Steve made the point, this makes our system more democratic. I would say there's also two other payoffs to kind of engaging in this kind of thinking and sort of beginning to discuss these kinds of reforms. Number one, there's a great disaffection, and there's a sense that our political system is frozen. We can't get anything done. And I think the idea that we can change our own system, that we can make our system work better, in many ways, I think can reinvigorate our democracy. I mean, give a greater sense of vitality to our democracy. And then the second point is that these reforms, we think, also have the potential to help transform the Republican Party. I mean, we've just been describing how all of these crutches are things that that exist in the current system, are the things that are contributing to the radicalization of the Republican Party. And so we're interested in these reforms, not because it helps one party or another, but because it introduces a kind of fairness to political competition that I think at the end of the day will give rise to two parties that have to win majorities. And if they have to win majorities, they will have to moderate, and our political system will just simply work more effectively.
Yeah, I think I look, as much as I've been in the odd position the last few years of supporting a Democratic president, I think Joe Biden's been a fine president given the circumstances. Um, I do think the country needs a center right party. I would love a party that driven by that, Burkean fierce love of liberty and all those things that we once that I once, as a Republican, believed in individual liberty and free markets and rule of law and constitutional adherence. I think all those things could and should be present in our politics. But right now, there's a party that's driven by racial animus and an obsession with power that is not just unseemly, but I think in defiance of the best examples America has set over the years when we've done the right thing. The peaceful transition of power was one of our fundamental things. We'd never crossed that red line until 2021, and I still go back and I look at that moment as we were very much teetering on the precipice that day. So my question is, in a sort of long-winded way, are you more worried about a slow corrosion of rights, liberties, norms, institutions, or a sudden shock? Because I've made this case before. It's sort of counterfactual, but if the mob had found Mitt Romney that day, or Nancy Pelosi, or Mitch McConnell, or anyone who wasn't a hard Trumper, and killed them, I honestly believe that the country would have basically, I think we would have basically collapsed as a nation. I think we would have ended up with Trump being able to engineer holding office. I think there were a bunch of Republican senators who were playing wait and see that day. So my question is, are you worried more about the slow erosion and corrosive nature of the anti-democratic movement, or do you worry about, I hate even using the word coup, but some sort of shocking event, some sort of inflection point where violence and political chaos breaks?
First of all, let me just point out that one of us in this room wrote an award-winning book about how democracies need strong center-right parties. There's a lot of political science research showing that democracies are healthier when they have a strong center-right party. So your intuition, Rick, I think is right on. Daniel may have a slightly different view. I'm considerably more concerned about the slow erosion of democracy, in part because, as we've seen over the last decade, we can allow the slow erosion occurs, and it does not trigger enough concern among our political elites to act. And I'm thinking particularly about mainstream Republican politicians, many of whom you know, Rick, many of whom you talk to, who in private are pretty concerned, but have not reached the line where they're willing to act. And I don't want to go back to the frog in boiling water metaphor, but it's true but it's a good one. And I just think it's more likely because, again, opposition forces in the United States are very strong. It's I actually think that if, God forbid, somebody like Romney or Pelosi had been killed on January 6th, it might have had the opposite effect. It might have actually had it might have triggered something in Republicans to, maybe they would have freaking convicted Trump in the Senate, which would have made a big difference, right?
Maybe.
I think we're already in the middle of that slow erosion. Not only are our norms badly weakened, not only are institutions starting to come undone, not only are things that used to be considered unthinkable now thinkable, but as Daniel pointed out, Americans are watching, especially younger Americans, are watching and saying, what good is this system? And Americans are gradually polls show this, losing faith in the system. And so eventually,
no question,
that gradual erosion, that poor performance of our democracy, people losing faith, people thinking this system isn't even democratic, may put us in a position decades down the road where we suffer a more of a coup-like event. I don't think that is really probable today.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Daniel?
mean, and I guess I think of the two as being very closely related. I mean, this reminds me of the line from The Sun Also Rises, where the characters ask, "How did you go bankrupt?" He says,
Slowly, then all at
yeah,
once.
yeah, gradually, then suddenly. So I think
Right.
the two are very much linked. I mean, the kind of final scene may look like a sudden collapse, but it's preceded by lots of gradual erosion. And it's it's more than just norms being violated. I mean, these international organizations like Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy, give democracy scores. And that's part of the thing that motivated us writing this book. We begin our book with this kind of paradox that the U.S., which is a rich democracy, is an old democracy. However you code the earliest days of American democracy, it's an old democracy. And usually these kinds of democracies don't get into trouble. And what's so shocking is that according to these international organizations, the U.S. has experienced democratic backslide between 2016 and 2020. And so whereas before 2016, we were on par on all of these international indices, along with, Canada, Germany, Britain. By 2020, we were below Argentina. We were below a lot of new democracies. We don't know. And the reason the Freedom House was scoring us in these ways was, we have a situation where you have election officials being threatened, and you have, an attempted halt to the transfer of power. You have assaults on voting rights. I mean, these are very specific things taking place in the U.S. that are an indication that democracy is really under siege. And so, and this is happening gradually. And so, we have to, it's not just a matter of speculation that this might come in the future. I mean, we're witnessing it right now. And I mean, the game is not up, but we have to recognize that the threat is current with us in the moment.
Right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining me today. Stephen Livitsky and Daniel Ziblatt are the authors of The Tyranny of the Minority and How Democracies Die. They are two, again, of the sharpest observers of our current crisis, and I appreciate both of you coming on the show today. Thank you so very much for being here.
Great talking.
Hey, tell people where they can find you on social media.
I'm on Twitter at Ziblatt. That's my BZIBLAT.
Yeah, I'm pretty non-existent on social media.
Steve is.
You were a wise man, Stephen. All right. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you.